Once again, we're broadcasting from radio station KUCB. And our motto here at KUCB is that we communicate, to educate, and organize, and truth is the wealth of freedom. We wanted to do another segment on no justice, no peace, and try to just explain the law as far as it relates to law when we say no justice, no peace. As we said in a previous segment that we did, you cannot have peace without justice. One goes with the other. You can't have just one and not have the other. So if there's no justice, it's not going to be any peace. And you know, it's really interesting that when you hear the various people, talking about the whole idea of police murder in the U.S. as it relates to minorities, as it relates to blacks and Hispanics and other minority groups in this country. It's interesting because this whole movement now has reached a discussion in the United Nations where they are talking about the whole events of police misconduct, if you will. And this is nothing new because maybe some of you recall, maybe some of you may not be old enough to remember, but El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, Malcolm X, he talked about this subject. He talked about this subject back in the 60s. He addressed this subject and talked about it in an extensive interview about police brutality. He talked about this. Nobody really wanted to hear it. Nobody really wanted to listen to him at that particular time. And most times when you are talking about a subject matter like this, nobody wants to hear, nobody wants to listen. But it goes beyond just police brutality. It goes to the core of the laws. If we talk about civil rights, Malcolm talked about human rights and the God-given right that you have as a person. Well, human rights is one of those rights that comes from Allah. Allah gives human rights to individuals. There's human rights that people have. But at the same time, you cannot have any justice if people don't have human rights. Not some of the human rights, not part of the human rights, but a full pledge of human rights. And so what we are talking about is we're talking about the laws in the U.S. We're talking about the laws in almost every major city that relates to police misconduct. And as I said, this whole movement has reached the point that the United Nations, now the only time I recall the United Nations saying something like they have been saying here at this particular junction in history, is back during the time when various people addressed the United Nations and talked about misconduct of the police departments in the U.S. because most times they don't usually want to talk about these subjects. They don't usually want to talk about these kind of matters. Everyone want to act like everything is okay, everything is all right, until something happens, then all of a sudden they want to have a discussion. But you see, and this is just a reference for history. I want you to go back and check, because if I recall, and my history serves me correctly, back in the 1980s, the early, maybe mid-1980s, at that particular time, police misconduct, police brutality was running rapid inside the U.S. in the early 1980s, the mid-1980s. And I recall at that particular time because I remember attending a national, they call a national summit on police brutality in the early 1980s, mid 1980s, because the same problem that they are having today, that we're having today, with police misconduct, with police brutality. If my history serves me right, we were having the same trouble in 1980, the early 1980s, the mid 1980s. And they summoned a national summit. That's how serious it was. They had a national summit on police brutality at that particular time. And so here we are some years down the road, and guess what? The problem is still with us. There's been no cure for this disease. There's been no cure for this sickness. There's been no cure for this, because it is the law. They have a law within every police department in the U.S. They have a policy, shoot to kill. They had a policy that's been in place for quite some time. They have a policy of deadly force. They have a policy of excessive force. And so all these people that be on these syndicated shows and CNN and Fox News and all these different discussions and whatever they're having now about police misconduct, it's always interesting, and none of these individuals will go back and see what was happening in the early 1980s, in the mid 1980s in this country, in the U.S., where they had to call a national summit on police misconduct, because the level at that particular time, if I recall, the level at that particular time of police murders, police excessive force, police using deadly force was just as high then as it is today. So I just find it interesting that here we are these years down the road, and we are talking about the same thing. And this is because nothing was done, no action was taken at that particular time. Out of that national summit, there was a list of demands. There was a list of things that people were saying that need to be done. But guess what? The lawmakers, the laws in this country did not move to take any action towards police misconduct. And this is why we have this growing out of control, out of hand police brutality, police misconduct today as we speak, because nothing was done about it back in the 1980s. We're talking about, like I said, the early 80s, the mid 80s. They convened a national summit. Now, I'm talking about a national summit, not a local summit. This was a national summit because police brutality was so out of control then. And let me just say this too, that here in Des Moines, Iowa, we have had police brutality, we have police murder, we have police misconduct, police using excessive force. We had the murder of Archie Simmons. This was back in the 70s. We had the murder of Clarence Jackson, a young 15-year-old African-American that was shot to death. We have the murder of Joe Mosey, who was murdered on the south side by a Des Moines police officer. We have the murder of Ricky Brown, who was murdered right behind the Forest Avenue Library here in Des Moines, Iowa. We have the murder of John Sharp, who was murdered while in custody of the Des Moines Police Department. We had a murder of John Moore Branch in his sister's yard on Garfield on the east side, who was murdered. We had the murder of Charles Dudley, who was murdered here in Des Moines, Iowa. So we have a list of murders that have taken place here in Des Moines, Iowa. And we're talking about the major cities. You know, so almost in every major city here in the U.S., police murder, police excessive force, and police brutality has taken place. And we're saying this is a law they have in place now, a law, shoot to kill. That's the law inside the U.S. Shoot to kill. Not shoot to wound, not to taser someone, but shoot to kill. That's the law. And so if we're going to have any kind of discussion about anything at any level, these various talk show hosts, these commentaries, these people that be in the media, why is it that you don't have a discussion and a talk about the law and the law that's in place that allow these kind of murders to take place? See, that's at the core of the issue, is the police murder, police excessive force, police using the deadly force because it's ingrained in the law in the society. Once again, we have been talking about injustice, and the fact is that there will be, you can't ask to have peace where there is no justice. Once again, you cannot ask to have peace and there is no justice. They both go together. In order to have peace, you must have justice. In order to have justice, you must have peace. So there's not one thing that's by itself. Both of these things go together. And so you can't ask to have one and not the other one. And so I understand people are calling for calmness and for peaceness in these various places. Well, what about the justice? Are you calling for justice like you're calling for peace? Ask yourself that question. When you get on a nationwide TV or you get on a talk show or whatever you might do, just as you're calling for peace, are you also calling for justice? See, at the same time. And if you're calling for both of these things at the same time, then you have to begin to discuss the fact of the kind of laws that have been put in place to allow these things to happen, to allow these things to go on. It's the law that have been put in place to allow these things to happen. A law that you can shoot to kill. A law that you can use excessive force. A law that you can use deadly force. Today inside the U.S., the kind of things that go on is no different than the apartheid treatment of the Africans in South Africa during the apartheid movement. Is no different than the things that went on during the civil rights movement. At the height of the civil rights movement, you had riots and you had looting to break out. So these kind of situations, they have always occurred in those kind of situations. I'm not excusing what the people are doing by looting and burning in businesses and shops and stores. I'm not excusing that, because that part of it is wrong. But the protests and the standing up and demonstrating, that's something that should continue to go on. The protests and demonstration. The looting, the burning and stuff, those kind of things should stop. But as far as the protests and demonstration, they should continue to keep those up. And I'll say to the people that's in Cleveland, Ohio, where you had a 12-year-old young African-American child murdered, you should be protesting there on a continuous base. For the people in Cleveland, Ohio, you should be speaking out, you should be protesting, you should be demonstrating, and you should be demanding that police officer who murdered that young African-American child should be charged with murder. He should be charged with murder, because that's simply what he did. Once again, you've been listening to KUCB Radio. Our motto here is truth is the wealth of freedom, and we communicate to educate and organize.